finally, after 4 trips to fill up the thing, I came back and I said, Dad, no more tea. I'm sorry, we're out of tea. And he said, what do you mean we're out of tea? I said, the toilet's empty.
He spent nearly 5 decades hiding behind a bow tie and a laugh that made an entire generation feel safe. Then, 2 years after his body was lowered into the ground, the man behind that laugh finally told the truth about who he really was. Paul Reubens passed away in July 2023, and for years afterward, the world assumed it already knew his story. It didn't. What has since come to light, through his own words, recorded before his death and released to the public afterward, reveals a life far more complicated, far more guarded, and far more human than the headlines of 1991 and 2002 ever allowed people to see. To understand why his final revelations landed with such force, you have to go back to where it all began. Paul Reubens was born in Peekskill, New York, in 1952, and raised largely in Sarasota, Florida, a town famous for its ties to the circus arts. That environment left a mark on him. He grew up around performers, around spectacle, around the idea that reinvention was not just possible but almost expected. His father had served as a fighter pilot before settling into a quieter life running a lamp store, and his mother worked as a schoolteacher, a combination of discipline and imagination that seemed to shape the contradictions in her son. After studying theater at Boston University and later at the California Institute of the Arts, he made his way into the Los Angeles comedy scene and joined the Groundlings, the same improvisational troupe that would later help launch performers like Phil Hartman and Lisa Kudrow. It was there, in the late 1970s, that Reubens began experimenting with a character sketch of a man-child with a squeaky voice, an ill-fitting suit, and a desperate need to be liked. That character was Pee-wee Herman, and in its earliest form, it was not for children at all. The original stage show carried an adult edge, full of innuendo and biting satire aimed squarely at grown audiences in comedy clubs across Los Angeles, including a run that drew notice at the Groundlings Theater itself, where Reubens first tested how far the character could be pushed before an audience of adults who understood exactly what he was doing. It wasn't until the character crossed into film and television that everything changed. In 1985, director Tim Burton, making his feature debut, brought Pee-wee to the big screen in Pee-wee's Big Adventure. The film was a modest but meaningful hit, earning strong reviews for its inventive visual style and introducing Reubens' creation to a mainstream audience far beyond the comedy club circuit. A year later, Reubens took the character even further with Pee-wee's Playhouse, a Saturday morning children's series that was strange, colorful, and unlike anything network television had produced before. The show blended education with surrealism, drawing visual inspiration from mid-century children's programming while filtering it through a distinctly countercultural sensibility. It worked. The series won a total of 15 Emmy Awards during its run and became one of the defining children's programs of the 1980s, later earning recognition as one of the most influential cult classics in American television history. Reubens didn't just perform Pee-wee. He built the world around him, co-creating characters, overseeing production, and blurring the line between actor and creation so completely that for years he refused to appear in public, or give interviews, without being fully in character. He avoided being photographed as himself, insisting that maintaining the illusion required total commitment, a decision that turned Pee-wee into something closer to a second identity than a role he could simply step out of at the end of a workday. That total immersion made Pee-wee Herman feel less like a performance and more like a parallel life. Colleagues who worked alongside him during the Playhouse years later described someone who seemed to disappear into the character so completely that distinguishing the performer from the persona became genuinely difficult, even for people who knew him well. And it is precisely that blurring of lines that made what happened next so devastating. In July 1991, Paul Reubens was arrested in Sarasota for indecent exposure at an adult movie theater. The story broke almost instantly, and because Reubens had spent so many years refusing to separate himself from his character, the public reaction wasn't just about an actor's private choices. It felt, to many, like a betrayal of the character itself. Television networks pulled reruns of Pee-wee's Playhouse within days. Toy deals dried up. Endorsements vanished. For a man who had built an entire career on being inseparable from a symbol of childhood innocence, the fallout was immediate and brutal. He entered a plea that resulted in community service and a fine, but the legal outcome mattered far less than the cultural verdict that had already been delivered. He would later reflect that the arrest, more than the legal consequences themselves, cost him the identity he had spent over a decade constructing, leaving him to grapple not just with public humiliation but with the sudden collapse of a persona that had become inseparable from his sense of self. What often gets lost in the retelling is that the legal charge itself was, in the eyes of many entertainment lawyers and commentators at the time, relatively minor, and involved no victim in the traditional sense. Still, the disconnect between the wholesome character and the tabloid headlines was too wide for much of the public to easily reconcile, even as pockets of support emerged, including gatherings by fans and fellow entertainers in cities like New York who argued the punishment far exceeded the offense. Reubens spent much of the 1990s working quietly to rebuild a career that had, almost overnight, been reduced to a punchline on late-night television. Just as he began finding his footing again, appearing in acclaimed supporting roles in films like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Batman Returns, and later Blow, a second and far more serious controversy emerged. In 2001, Reubens' Los Angeles home was searched by law enforcement as part of an investigation connected to explicit materials, reportedly prompted by a tip that reached the Los Angeles Police Department. Investigators removed a large collection of items from his residence, including vintage photographs and film reels, with reports at the time describing tens of thousands of items catalogued during the search. The case drew intense media scrutiny, not only because of who Reubens was, but because the nature of the collection raised difficult and disturbing questions about content involving minors. His attorney, Blair Burke, a lawyer known for representing entertainment figures in sensitive legal matters, argued that much of the material fell into a category of vintage erotica and physique photography that predated modern obscenity statutes and existing case law, and that framing became central to his legal defense. The case dragged on for years, moving through California's court system amid periods of restricted public access to certain records, a secrecy that fueled speculation and left many details of the proceedings unresolved in the public record. In 2004, Reubens entered a plea in connection with one charge, resulting in penalties that did not include imprisonment. Additional related charges were later dismissed in 2007 under provisions of California law allowing petitioners who had completed their sentencing requirements to seek dismissal. Reubens ultimately acknowledged possessing images of minors and was required to register in connection with the case, an outcome that stood in stark and painful contrast to the nostalgia so many still carried for Pee-wee Herman. For years, the ambiguity around exactly what was found, and how it should be understood, fueled ongoing debate. Some observers argued Reubens had been treated disproportionately, pointing to inconsistencies in how the case was handled and a lack of full transparency throughout the legal process. Others emphasized that regardless of legal technicalities, the discovery itself was serious enough to permanently alter how the public viewed him, and that celebrity should not soften accountability. That divide, between sympathy for a flawed man under enormous scrutiny and concern over what had actually been found in his possession, never fully resolved in the years that followed. It simply went quiet, as Reubens slowly, cautiously, returned to work, carrying the weight of a reputation that could never be fully repaired. His comeback was real, even if it never reached the heights of the 1980s. He appeared in Mystery Men, lent his voice to television projects, hosted the irreverent game show You Don't Know Jack, and eventually brought Pee-wee back to the stage in a Broadway revival in 2010 that was met with genuine warmth from audiences who had never stopped loving the character, even if they remained wary of the man behind him. In 2016, he co-wrote and starred in Pee-wee's Big Holiday, a Netflix original film that introduced the character to a new generation of viewers who had grown up hearing about Pee-wee secondhand. Throughout this period, Reubens gave interviews sparingly and guarded his private life with the same intensity he once used to protect the mystique of Pee-wee himself, rarely allowing journalists close enough to ask about what had truly shaped him. What almost no one outside his closest circle knew was that Reubens had been diagnosed with cancer years before his death and had chosen to keep that battle almost entirely private, continuing to work and make occasional public appearances while privately undergoing treatment. When he died in July 2023 at the age of 70, the news of his illness came as a shock to nearly everyone, fans and colleagues alike, precisely because he had guarded it so completely. In a statement released after his death, it was revealed that he had asked that his diagnosis remain private, not wanting sympathy to define his final years the way scandal had once defined his middle ones, a final act of control over a narrative that had so often been taken out of his hands. It is what came after his death, however, that has reshaped how the public understands him. In the years before he passed, Reubens sat for dozens of hours of interviews with documentary filmmaker Matt Wolf, recordings he knew would only be released posthumously. Those interviews became the foundation of the HBO documentary Pee-wee as himself, released in 2025, in which Reubens speaks candidly, for the first time in his life, without the character as a shield. In those conversations, he discussed his sexuality, something he had never publicly addressed during his lifetime, describing relationships with men and the immense pressure he felt to keep that part of himself hidden throughout a career built on wholesome, all-American appeal. He spoke about the toll that decades of concealment took on him, and about his complicated, sometimes resentful, sometimes grateful relationship with a character that had both made him famous and, in his own words, made him disappear into someone else's expectations. The documentary does not excuse the controversies of his past, but it recontextualizes them, revealing a man who spent his entire adult life performing not just for an audience, but for his own survival within an industry and a culture that had little room for complexity in its stars. Friends and collaborators who appear in the film describe someone deeply lonely behind the public warmth, someone who built an elaborate creative universe partly because it was safer than revealing his own inner world. Wolf has said in interviews promoting the film that Reubens remained deeply conflicted about the project even as he made it, wrestling until the very end with how much of himself he was willing to let the world finally see. Paul Reubens' story resists easy conclusions. He created something joyful and enduring in Pee-wee Herman, a character that taught kindness and curiosity to millions of children and remains, decades later, a touchstone of American pop culture, referenced by comedians, filmmakers, and performers who grew up watching him. He